Energy is what powers our economies and what shapes our society. The advent of highly efficient electric motors, batteries, and heat pumps, coupled with the climate crisis and the geopolitical shocks to the fossil fuel energy supply chains, are accelerating the transition to renewables. Nonetheless, fossil fuels represent a large portion of our energy envelope and will do so for some time to come. What's obvious is that we need to start thinking about energy holistically. Generation and storage will become more distributed. Demand response will become more variable. Energy flows will become more micro-transactional. I'm Doug Heinzman. I'm the Chief Catalyst at BRI. Welcome back to W3B Talks, an ongoing discussion about how Web3, blockchain, and AI will impact business and society. In this episode, we're going to look at the energy transition. And I can think of very few people in the world better equipped to help us on this topic than Vikram Seth. Vikram is the head of blockchain and Web3 at Shell. Welcome to the podcast, Vikram.
Thanks, Doug, and thanks for having me here.
This is a topic that I've wanted to get to for a very, very long time. The energy transition is a topic that I've done a lot of research in, a lot of reading about, and that I care quite deeply about. So first of all, thank you so much for joining us, because I think this is going to be a very important conversation. Perhaps the best place to start is to just ask you a very simple question. What, in your mind, in your experience, how do you define the energy transition?
Yeah, it's a great place to start, and it's a beast of a topic. So I do look forward to the conversation as well. What I would say is we are always in energy transition as a human society. We've been on this journey for thousands of years, where we've been going progressively from less dense energy carriers to more dense energy carriers as we've gone from whale oil, for example, to the next thing. We're now at a crossroads in that process, where currently we're using one of the most dense energy carriers known to man, which is primarily oil, but then coal and gas alongside. We do have the next piece on the horizon, which is nuclear and specifically fusion, but we're not really there yet with the technology. And simultaneously, we've come up against the planetary boundaries and the question of climate change, which is directly related to the consumption of these dense energy carriers, which have built our society. So I would say whilst we've been on this constant journey of energy transition, we're now at a time where it's fundamentally impacting the way we live and the resource base upon which we depend, and the biosphere upon which we depend, which is, of course, not a challenge we have necessarily encountered previously.
In my observation is that there is an increasingly large number of people around that understand that climate change is a really, really big problem, and that we have to do something about this, or else a lot of living on this planet becomes a lot more difficult. And yet, at the same time, there's a lot of discomfort around economic stress, around inflation, around the war in Ukraine, and as I said earlier, some of the shocks to the energy supply chain. And so energy security starts to become a much, much bigger issue. And it seems to me that the hope of kind of a rapid transition to complete electrification from renewables that we saw just a few years ago, that it's taken a bit of a step back, that we have to start thinking about a more pragmatic, probably a slower, a little more politically sensitive transition strategy. Have I got that right? And related to that, what role do you think that liquefied natural gas and perhaps even microthorium reactors play in that renewed strategy?
I think you've hit the nail on the head. So I think really pre-COVID, we were in an environment with low interest rates, with a lot of energy behind ESG initiatives, and a lot of interest in the market amongst consumers as well as corporates to really push in that direction. And we've been through a number of years now since 2020, where a lot of the drivers that I've just described there have deteriorated. So, of course, on the economic side, we've gone from a very low to non-existent interest rate world to much higher interest rates, which impact then the business case, particularly for renewables, which are very heavy on the upfront capital investment side. Secondly, we have indeed been dealing with other challenges, firstly COVID and then Ukraine war, which has moved the priority towards reliability and affordability in our energy system. That doesn't mean that sustainability has gone away. It has taken a back seat because the focus has been on making sure that we get the energy where we need it first, as opposed to what the source of that energy actually was. Now, in there, you raise an interesting point around liquefied natural gas, LNG, because regardless of these other drivers, LNG has anyway presented itself as a sort of stopgap towards a more renewables world, where simply from an energy management standpoint, renewables, which let's define it primarily as what we're talking about is solar and wind, have an intermittency problem, right? Sun doesn't shine at night and wind blows when it blows, and we don't have control over that. What we do have control over is when we turn a gas plant on and off, how much we ramp it up, how much we ramp it down. We do have control over that. And so LNG anyway was providing, intended and envisioned to be providing this flex ability, which can support the intermittency of renewables. On top of that, LNG it also is 30 to 40% cleaner in terms of carbon emissions than coal and oil. So you kind of, with LNG, you get this sweet spot where it's lower emissions inherently. It's also supporting lower emissions that you would get from a renewable energy system. But at the same time, we have the infrastructure in place to be able to transport it around the world. It looks like oil and gas. It's a liquid that we can transport. We have global markets around it. And we also fundamentally have the ability to control the generation. So it's a nice stopgap in there. I would say on the nuclear piece, there's many different solutions which are in the pipeline. And yes, having microthorium can support. I'm less clear on how quickly we can get to that point, but LNG, for example, is ready to go. And particularly Shell has made huge bets on LNG by acquiring BG, for example, and really focusing a lot in that space.
But you put your finger on a really interesting dilemma. You're quite right. The cost of capital has gone up considerably. The physical infrastructure required for the full energy transition is going to be very, very capital intensive. And so it's going to be very, very expensive in this current capital environment to fund that. But at the same time, even right now, if you're going to build a new coal peaker plant, it's going to be much more expensive than building a new solar farm. To say nothing of the fact that a lot of the infrastructure going into fossil fuels will be a stranded asset, right? You're not going to have a long-term payback for that. And so it becomes very difficult, even if the demand's there, it's very difficult to cost justify the deployment of new exploration and new large-scale infrastructure to support what in pretty short order, in the grand scheme of things, is going to be stranded assets. So we find ourselves caught between these two problems that are in conflict with each other. How do we navigate that?
It's interesting, right? Because we have a trilemma in both the blockchain space. We've got the blockchain trilemma of decentralization, security, scalability. But you also have an energy trilemma. And the energy trilemma is, again, energy security, affordability, and then the net zero challenge. What that low interest rate world allowed us to do was it didn't force us to have to make a choice between those three things. We were almost able to just pour money into all of it. And indeed, where we are now is we need to make choices because the capital is constrained. I'm just going to maybe go on a little bit of a tangent here because this is the thing I find really exciting about the blockchain Web3 space is, yes, there's the interesting piece around how can blockchain provide a new sort of operating system, a distributed and decentralized operating system for the distributed and decentralized energy system of the future. But the other really interesting piece is the incentive structures that you can embed into complementary currencies, for example, right, if I use that term, and smart contracts, etc. So, for example, one of the things that we've seen in the carbon markets, and I'll call out a specific example, which is KlimaDAO. KlimaDAO, if you're not familiar, right, in November 2021, KlimaDAO launched, and basically what they did was they used Toucan protocols, tokenized carbon credits. So they brought carbon credits on chain, but more importantly, they allowed carbon credits to be traded in decentralized exchanges, which pulled in all of this retail investor interest. And what you see if you look at the volume of carbon credits traded over time is there's this huge blip around November 2021, November, December, sort of before the whole thing kind of pretty much got shut down by the main registry saying, hey, we don't support this. But the point is, it highlighted a few things. One, that there is huge latent interest from retail investors to actually support and get involved in this space. So we're aware of ESG on the corporate side and on the financial institution side. But what this also showed is that individuals are willing to get involved. Now, is that speculation? Is it purpose-driven capital? That can all be debated and looked into. But for the first time, particularly in the carbon markets, that was enabled by having this sort of KlimaDAO process. The second thing it showed is not just the level of interest, but how much capital there was coming in from retail investors. And so the couple of things that really enabled this was, one, tokenizing carbon credits, and secondly, removing that barrier to entry, which essentially was there saying, unless you're an accredited investor or have an existing carbon trading desk, you can't participate in these markets. Now, that is what I see as very interesting to explore. If you open up this kind of source of capital, you might find that some of this capital is not so constrained by higher interest rates and is purpose-driven and would be interested to get involved and pour some of this into low-carbon projects or renewables projects, etc. And they don't have the vested interests that the incumbents in the energy space have. This is coupled with the fact that the energy landscape that we're moving away from is this highly centralized, highly hierarchical energy landscape. What you need, you need to pool capital, and you also need multiple partners to get involved to reduce the risk of, for example, throwing billions of dollars into a dry oil well. But we're moving away from that kind of a landscape in many aspects, because we're moving towards cheap solar panels on top of your car roof, batteries inside your car, et cetera, right? Okay. And so you have this.
So first of all, I'm delighted that you've made the pivot into the space I really want to get to, but I think it's actually probably useful to divide this conversation into two pieces. So the first piece that you were talking about, the way I like to think about it, is the tokenization of externalities, right? There is this reality that fossil fuels have benefited from an enormous subsidy, not only governmental subsidies in terms of dollars to help exploration for economic development, but an environmental subsidy, right? That pollution has been free, but it actually has a real cost. It's just not a cost that is borne by the consumption and usage of the product itself. It's something that we have to deal with, because there's more hurricanes and there's more weather shifts, and malaria gets to go to higher latitudes, and there's all these externalities. So the carbon marketplace is an example of the idea of tokenizing a type of pollution to capture the value of that externality, of that subsidy, and reintroduce it into the marketplace so that we can have pricing signals and can make different decisions. And a lot of the oil and gas companies are being very proactive. Blockchain for Energy just released a very impressive new blockchain AI-driven solution for molecular carbon tracing across supply chains. And we need to start counting this stuff. So I completely agree that the carbon marketplaces are important, that we need to get much better about using IoT and AI and blockchain altogether to make sure that we're properly ledgering this stuff so that there's enough credibility in it, and the skepticism about companies just doing marketing greenwashing is kind of tamped down. And not only is this a mechanism for institutional investors to kind of move value around, but to the point you were on, that individuals, consumers, start to get greater visibility. I mean, I just built this house that I'm sitting in here, and it's got super insulation and heat pumps and a lot of really advanced energy conservation technologies. And as a result, it has a much, much, much smaller energy profile than the one it replaced. But when the energy audit came in, it called out exactly how many tons of CO2 I'm saving every year compared to an average house, compared to the house it replaced, and all that kind of stuff. So as a consumer, I'm starting to get much more awareness of the decisions I make individually to get a hybrid or a plug-in electric car, or super insulate my house, or moderate my demand response so that I'm doing things in the middle of the night and not during peak utilizations. More information we have, the better quality decisions we can make. So that's kind of one part of the equation. I completely agree with the points that you're making, that we're getting much better at that, and those markets are becoming much more efficient and much more open and much more inclusive. And I would love it if the dashboard of my car told me how much CO2 pollution I created, and that as I'm traveling at a different speed down the highway, that it's telling me not only how much gas or electricity I'm using, but what my environmental impact is. We have to start exposing that. But the second part of the story is where you just started to go, which is really interesting. And that's the question of, how does this technology provide a platform for the next energy industry, for the transactive energy industry? When we have solar panels on our houses and batteries in our basement and massive batteries parked in our driveways or in our parking lots, and they've got solar cells on them or wind generation. And if I'm on the east side of the street, that I'm selling energy to my neighbor during the afternoon, and he's on the west side and he's selling me energy in the morning. And, you know, there's just electrons flying back and forth, and the electric utility is setting up contracts with my washing machine and my refrigerator in order to spool them up or spool them down, depending on the actual real-time price of an electron. To me, this is a tremendously exciting world. But what is the role of the technologies we've been talking about, blockchain, AI, IoT, as the platform that allows that kind of vision to happen?
I think you've laid out the vision quite nicely there as well. So this is a space where, if you come at it from the technologist lens, it's like pushing the technology onto the problem. But if you take a broader lens, and again, coming back to the vision, that's exactly the way we think about it, right? So imagine that the household of the future, where you have these smart contracts set up. Each device inside your house has a smart contract set up. It's enabled, it's smart, it's IoT enabled, and you can program everything from your washing machine, your refrigerator, your air conditioner or your heating, but also to your, Bitcoin miner or your AI, small AI GPU data center, which you've got inside your house, and connected up as well to your car. But then it's also connected to your local supermarket, so that your local supermarket can get the excess power from your own solar panels on your rooftop, or your wind generation from your garden or something, as opposed to pulling on the LNG plant, which is 1,000 miles away. And the way that the grid is set up right now really struggles to allow that to take place, because what we have fundamentally is a unidirectional grid system. And it's not because it's physically in that, it's set up like that. It's because the utilities that operate these are set up like that. It's very difficult for a utility to pay you for your power. It's as opposed to you paying them for the power they provide to you, right? So there's layers upon layers here. We've got a payments layer. We've got a physical electron transfer layer. But then we've also got a financial settlement layer. We've also got the commercial relationships and the way those are set up. But then that goes back towards how do you actually operate these centralized power plants as well. That's going to be impacted. And this comes back to your stranded assets question as well, right? We're not just talking about stranded oil and gas assets. We're also talking about stranded power plants, because if now 20% of your electricity generation shifts or disappears from a centralized power plant because that demand it's disappeared because of demand response. You've actually reduced that power demand because you don't need it at night or whatever. But the other part of it's disappeared because you've got it from your own solar panels on your roof and your EV. And the other part's disappeared because I'm now getting it from my neighbor instead of from the grid. That also means that the economics of the existing power plants and the existing utility infrastructure changes dramatically. The other piece here is that grid infrastructure is set up in such a way to alleviate congestion points around where there's big generation and big demand centers. But if we're distributing the way that works as well, we need smarter grids as well. And we also need to change the way that we set up the grid system. So there are at least 3 or 4 levels of change here. And then when we talk about how can blockchain, IoT, AI help, the answer is different at whichever level you're looking at. You can look at it at a household and a local area level to almost be enabling this kind of microgrid within your local community, where you can have peer-to-peer trading within that. But then you need to have a better way of managing the grid system, using AI, for example, as well, to even figure out, well, which load points are going to stick around, which ones aren't. How could you optimize vehicle to home charging, for example, or even vehicle to vehicle, which is something we see taking place as well. And then you've got the other level, which is now what on earth do these massive centralized generation points do? And we're far away from that reality where this entire landscape is actually being optimized. At the moment, what we have is we have pockets of optimization taking place. So we have, to be honest, really experiments more at the local level. There's a lot more penetration of blockchain and AI at the utility scale level, looking at more around traceability and tracking the origin of the energy source. So is more right now around, is my electricity renewable or not? That needs to move much more towards actually optimizing and having this feedback loop where it goes back and then turns on and off. But it's very difficult to have that without having this connection all the way through the system. And this is where I think fundamentally a blockchain mindset can help to support, because what this new energy system really looks like, if you map it out from an architecture point, is we now have millions of nodes, and each of these nodes have different functions, and some of them have multiple functions. And then you want to be able to trace and track between these and see what is the optimum for each of these different nodes. And each node itself also has a number of kind of input-output control devices, which would be your IoT devices, and then bringing in another piece of the puzzle, which would be edge computing, that you could kind of get these individual devices to actually try and do some local optimization for themselves, right? To figure out, okay, well, Doug actually typically goes and uses his car at this time, and the energy is cheapest to charge the vehicle at this time, so we're going to do that. And then somewhere else in this large connected system, you have the feedback back to the power plant somewhere. So this gets complex very, very quickly, and it's far more complex than in the energy system we've had.
Yes, I think the point you're making is very interesting. The system we've had traditionally moves from generation through transmission through consumption. And the way that we dealt with things is we monitored how much load there was on the network, and then we bring on extra capacity in the form of peaker plants to deal with the various different surges in demand. But those peaker plants are typically very polluting because they're often coal plants or oil plants and relatively expensive to build. But I think what you're saying is that going forward, certainly there's the electrical infrastructure component. We still need wires to move stuff around. But there's an informational backplane to this that has a number of interesting dynamics, that we have distributed generation, either individual on a house or in a car or by community. Like we've already seen community solar farms coming into place. There's the potential of building a much more resilient grid because, a major storm, an ice storm, could take down a big transmission line or a substation, and then big chunks of a city or, in fact, a province or state could be taken out of commission. Whereas in a distributed environment, the whole thing becomes much, much more resilient. You might have local outages of a few houses, but you just have so much more capacity to reroute stuff all around. We've now got this potential of having this information backplane. One of the great epiphanies I had was a number of years ago. It was about 2017 or so. I was doing some research in this space, and I noticed that there was a company in California that won the biggest portion, California's annual demand response auction. Every year, California, because there's an awful lot of load, it goes to big industries and says, listen, I'm going to pay you if you will cooperate with me that when the grid's under a lot of stress, you're going to take load off of the grid. You're going to turn your factory off or tune it down. So very energy intensive industries would sign up and basically get compensated for not consuming electricity when the grid was under a lot of stress. But in this year, the biggest winner of that auction was a brand new company, hadn't been in business for 6 months or something. And they weren't a big industry. They weren't a big electrical consumer. But what they had done is they had gone out and found there were about 128,000 houses that had Google Nest thermostats in them and aggregated all of those thermostats. Because they were now network connected IoT devices, they could basically, instead of them, give them $100 a year or something like that for permission to alter their thermostat by 2 degrees up to 4 times a year. And lots of people signed up for that. But they could aggregate that and sell that back to the grid. And for me, this was a complete light bulb going off that said, well, wait a second, it's not just about transmission and consumption and putting peaker plants on. It's about a holistic view of the whole system that involves not only production and transmission, and in the case of renewables, storage, but it also incorporates this demand response component in order to provide stability to the overall grid. And I think as we get smarter and smarter devices, and as you pointed out, kind of edge computing as well, that we're going to have all of these information flows running all over the place that have tremendous potential to fine-tune this next generation grid. But the information infrastructure to support that, the ledgering of all of that incoming data, the AI to be able to analyze all the patterns involved and figure out what the best optimization strategies are and how to price things. Because one of the great things is if all these smart devices out there that are automated and that are using smart contracts to talk to each other, there can be, if we're clever enough, we can put pricing signals into everything that allows us to stabilize the grid and optimize its collective efficiency. So I'm a big believer, as I know you are, that the future of the energy industry involves this very comprehensive informational backplane that is really the magic of fine-tuning the system, demand response, storage, transmission. Am I completely out of my mind here?
No, not at all. Not at all. I think that, so you just, again, described that very well. That's the way I think of this is 3 layers. You've got the physical infrastructure layer, which is what we've been talking about. You've got the underlying layer, which is data. And this data is being captured by the various devices, IoT, etc. It's being, you capture the data, then you're doing the compute, and then you're doing the feedback loop to go back and turn on, turn off, ramp up, ramp down the physical. But then there's this third layer, which is kind of what you were alluding to here, which is the commercial relationships layer. So what does this mean in terms of contracts? In this scenario, you've got this company sitting in the middle aggregating their data, nor is it their physical network. But what it does is it introduces this new business model where you can dream up brand new commercial constructs to manage this. And we will need that, right? Because the utilities are absolutely not set up to do this themselves, at least the way they are right now. It's so complex for households to do. And you can't, you can optimize at your own household level or your own factory level, but that's not good enough because that's not sufficient. You don't get the efficiencies that you're talking about there if you're doing it at such a small scale. So we have this gap where is that aggregation layer or this new commercial construct where it can be this bridge in the middle. Now, one way we can have that is, it's a new commercial entity, a new group of people who are sitting there as intermediaries, collecting the data, paying X, and then charging 2X for the service. But this is something where I believe we can take the distributed protocols and take what we've kind of been seeing in decentralized finance to have decentralized energy protocols where a lot of this can be embedded into smart contracts, which are pulling on AI compute to actually process a lot of this information themselves. I'm not working on this yet. I don't really know anybody who is working on this yet, but this is where I see things going. I do expect that we would need to get there because otherwise this is such a complex space to navigate, and new business models are constantly emerging from this space. There is another entirely separate point that comes out of this whole picture as well, which is that so far we've been talking about the impact of this energy transition, but we've also got all the other petrochemicals products, right? We've also got the whole impact on supply chain and materials, and what does that look like? So I'm just throwing that out there because there's a lot in there as well that I see getting impacted.
I think that's a brilliant point. A lot of us, the regular people, don't have a lot of visibility into the upstream, midstream, downstream system in oil and gas, or frankly behind electrical grids. And, they know when there's a brownout or a blackout, and they know how expensive things are when they get their bill and all. But we don't really appreciate those back-end systems. So I think that's a very good point. And I think that there's a ton of IoT and AI and blockchain being applied to efficiencies in maintenance, supply chain, tracing and tracking, contracting, multi-party contracting, all the regulatory compliance, lots and lots of stuff like that. I also like where you were going with this idea that there's this gap or this opportunity, because you're right. I'm not going to be, I've got, solar cells, an electric car, windmill or whatever. I'm not going to be going to my neighbors, knocking on their door and saying, okay, here's the deal. I'll send you X number of electrons during this hour. If you do this, I'll price it. That's just not going to happen. And I don't even have efficient information to make high quality decisions about pricing and availability and the risk that I want to take on and that kind of stuff. So there's going to need to be professionals that's what they do and they're very good at it, that are going to enter the marketplace and help us put those things together. I believe we have to get there, right? Because the alternative is not pleasant. We cannot continue indefinitely on the carbon road because, number one, at some point we're going to run out of this stuff. But even long before we run out of this stuff, we're going to cause such irreparable harm to our climate that the consequences are difficult to fathom. So I wonder what the big event is that's going to help us change. We've been progressively getting there. More and more of us have programmable thermostats. And I myself am on a system where I am compensated every year because I volunteered that the utility can manipulate my thermostat to some extent. So I'm already personally involved in that kind of system. And I suspect more and more of us are going to be doing that kind of thing. Do you think that the weakness in all of this, that you've already pointed to it, is the storage component? That generation is coming down, right? At some point in the very not too distant future, especially with new technologies like perovskites coming online for solar generation, it's going to become incredibly compelling for people to put solar cells on top of their roofs or putting them into local space. Just the cost per kilowatt hour generation just fallen so much that this just becomes an obvious and tremendously compelling thing to do. So that's fine and well. And by the way, especially important in coastal regions that are having problems with potable water. A huge amount of Saudi Arabia's vast electrical generation capability, which is oil-based, like 70 some odd percent of it goes into desalination. So there's these massive energy needs for things as basic as potable water. I've had it in my head that the thing that really changes the landscape has to do something with storage. And I suspect that it is cars. We've seen really quite rapid, faster than most analysts had dared predict, a transition to the electrification of transportation. And when we just have so many cars that are idle for so much of their time in existence, that just kind of sit there, that if we can have systems that are smart enough to understand what our schedule is and what our needs are going to be, and are smart enough to understand what the variable electricity inputs are, including generation from my own roof going into my car, that I've got 100 kilowatt hours of batteries sitting in my driveway, just like 10 million other people within 500 square kilometers of here, assuming that we can put them in parking lots or at home and stuff, and that they're actually plugged in. And we've got not only vehicle to load and vehicle to home, but also vehicle to grid. And they're participating, and basically it's an auction, right? The grid comes out and says, listen, I need some electricity. I'm willing to pay you twice as much for the electricity to pull out of your battery than I charged you to put the electricity into the battery. There's some price point that kind of makes sense. But for a while, I've been thinking or hoping perhaps that hardest part of the physical part of the whole equation, which is the storage component, in my estimation, the electrification of transportation is the most obvious way to attack that problem. And I hope it might happen sooner than later. Is this just wishful thinking? What do you think of that scenario?
I think that the end point I agree with. How quickly are we going to get there? I don't necessarily think we're going to get there that quickly, right? Because essentially there's a few things here. So how do we manage the intermittency problem of renewables? There's essentially three ways, and we've talked about all three of them now. One is demand response, which is you literally just reduce the demand to the point when the renewable is actually generating. The other two are storage and some other flex asset. And we talked about the flex asset, which is LNG. That is the lowest hanging fruit after demand response. That is the lowest hanging fruit. And globally, we are building out much more LNG. We are pushing that much more LNG piece. It is the affordable one. It's the one which is already there. It's the low hanging fruit. It's also cleaner. So I think we're going to manipulate that one a lot more. And in the background, what that does is we allow this kind of increasing electric vehicle penetration to play out, because it's happening anyway, right? We've been having subsidies for electric vehicles in different jurisdictions, whether that's Europe or the US. And we now see China kind of churning out a lot more lower cost EVs. You've got regulations which are already there, which essentially say that by 2035, 2040, and again, it's different in different jurisdictions, but pretty soon enough, no new internal combustion engine vehicles to be sold, at least for passenger vehicles. And so I think what happens is that we use the LNG piece in the interim and exploit that. But what's in the background, we have this continued acceleration of penetration of EVs into the system. And then the more we have that, the more storage devices we have to be able to manage. Simultaneously, we will start to see the constraints on the grid as well. And we will start to see utilities having to respond. I would say really on a much bigger scale, after 5-7 years from now, we would really see this whole system coming together, because you also need those coordination networks to be there to incentivize you to do that. Because what we have right now is the reverse of the transaction that you said. You get half of what you pay to the grid if you give your power back to the grid today. What we want is we want to get that going the other way around, but it's not sophisticated enough today, the utility and for you to really understand when the grid is constrained sufficiently that it's actually worth your while to put more power into the grid. So I think all of these different areas need to play out. So I think the optimism is well placed. I believe in the vision. I think it might still take some time for a lot of these technologies to play out before we get there.
So we've talked a bit about, first of all, the IoT component, because you need to be able to count stuff and measure stuff and interact with stuff. And that's the bridge from the digital world to the physical world. We've talked a little bit about the blockchain component that says you need to ledger all of this information because you're going to be counting lots of stuff and you've got to be making decisions, which is the smart contract part of it that puts all the automation into it, that when this happens, then do this. And when that happens, transfer value over to there and be able to create actual marketplaces and use price signals and all that kind of stuff. So that makes total sense to me that you need those two components. The third big component, I think, especially in the current zeitgeist of the moment, is AI. I suspect that some of the recent advances in AI, especially as it pertains to this domain, around decision support and prediction, I have a gut feeling that there's something important here. We measure stuff and we count stuff and we build economies around stuff. But if we can use the experience of doing that to make high quality predictions and then automate decision support around those predictions, I suspect there's something big here, that this is going to be a big part of this next generation system. How do you see AI intersecting this space, and what role do you think it's going to play in the new energy economy?
We actually already use AI in all its various guises, because there's machine learning, there's generative, etc. But to a large degree, if we take the broad definition of AI, we already use AI to quite some degree in the energy industry, whether that is predictive maintenance, for example, but even to the point of detecting whether operatives on an asset are wearing a hard hat or not, using machine vision, for example. And the other space that it's really well deployed already is in the trading space, essentially predicting patterns in markets, etc., to support traders as well. But also weather modeling and things like this, which can dramatically affect supply chain routes and also can pose kind of opportunities for arbitrage for traders. So I think the space that I see AI really transforming the game when it comes to the energy industry is really around automation, because then you take all of these insights, the data, the insights, etc. Right now, it's still very much a human in the loop who actually looks at the output and then figures out what to do next. But closing that loop and then having the confidence in these AI tools to operate, I mean, if I go all the way out there, right, have entirely autonomous generation plants, for example. And it's not as dramatic if you think of a wind farm, but if you think of an oil rig, which is very complex, quite dangerous, there's a lot of different moving parts, there are a lot of decisions to be made very quickly as well. You're dealing with different pressure changes all the time. And if it's offshore, you're dealing with multiple different unpredictable factors. I expect to see, for example, a lot more unmanned operations, a lot more just simply entirely autonomous processes, which then are monitored by humans as opposed to humans just taking the output and then doing the operations themselves. So that's, I think, a dramatic change, which can lead to efficiencies, but it could also lead to better ways of doing things that we simply can't do right now because, for example, you need to send a helicopter to an offshore asset. Some of these things will translate back into lower cost energy, but some of them will also translate into, the piece we were talking about, which is better optimized energy systems. There is a big challenge with AI that I think I think we miss quite a lot as well, which is that if you really start to look at where this goes, the energy demand of AI looks like it's going to be pretty exponential as well, because the limitation on AI right now is essentially computing power. But part of that is compute, the other part is the power part, and the computing power needs to be supported by actual power. And that presents quite some challenges, I think, as well, because if you think of, for example, Jevons paradox here, where the cheaper it gets, the more we use. So our overall bill doesn't come down. We actually just end up using more of it. And here we've again, back to the original dilemma, we don't just have a cost budget, we've also got a carbon budget. And so kind of bringing this whole conversation back full circle, when everything has edge computing and AI at the edge embedded in it, the total energy needs of the world are simply going to be multiple orders of magnitude greater than they are today, because not everything is electrified today, but we are electrifying as much as we can. To have everything smart, it's going to be electrified. And then to also have this computing power sitting in there. I think that's a very interesting challenge that the energy industry faces, but also the tech and AI industry faces as well.
Yeah, I think that's fair. I also think that, like most things in an economy, you figure out what the cost-benefit ratio is. And if something has a massive benefit relative to the cost, then it's interesting. And if it's the opposite, then it's not. So as long as we're really good about incorporating those externalities and building systems that have efficient pricing mechanisms, the system will be self-adjusting, and there will be high incentives to figure out better and more energy efficient and thus cost and pollution efficient ways of doing things. And we're already seeing a lot of progress made on training sets and inference engines and more efficient chips and new approaches and multi-model systems. There's already a lot of progress towards that. But I think your point is well taken, but I'm an optimist, and I hope that it's not an insurmountable problem. Just a few little quick final questions that I think would be interesting is, off the top of your head, do you think there's any technologies that we haven't talked about yet that may be under the radar that may impact the future of energy that you've run into that maybe not a lot of people know about?
So I think in a lot of the conversations that I have, very few people are really aware of how much energy companies themselves are looking at the technologies we've already talked about, in terms of really looking at how do you bring AI, blockchain, IoT, high performance computing, and even ultimately quantum computing together. In many of the conversations I've had, people are surprised that that's not just simply the domain of the tech industry and it's just applied by an energy company. But actually, fundamentally, we're involved in building out the application of these as well. It gets really interesting when you start to look at things like physics-informed neural networks. So when you really start to pull some of these things together and you pull in AI and you pull in neural network, you pull in physics, and you start to look at some of these like new materials that can be developed. These are also some of the things that is in the cutting edge of research in this space, looking at materials for both solar panels and as well as to produce more efficient power plants. Honestly, it's more the application of AI, which is the interesting thing. CCS and direct air capture.
Aside from at source, capturing it off the top of a well and trying to capture methane so it doesn't escape, and a few projects that involve scrubbing and stuff into caverns under pressure, which I'm a little skeptical about because I think that there's going to be leakage. We need to figure out how to store this stuff in rock, right? Highly stable systems. I am hopeful that we're going to find some solutions for that. There's going to be some creative chemistry and we'll someday we'll have these massive CO2 scrubbers that just sit there in the wind sucking up CO2. But we're going to have to figure out, first of all, how to do that efficiently, and second of all, how to store it stably. I'm hopeful, but it's a little science fiction-y for me at this point.
I wouldn't say I'm a huge fan of CCS and direct air capture, at least where it is today.
Well, I think that there's just lower hanging fruit. I mean, we should absolutely work on it. But for all the people out there that are going to hang their hats on that and saying, oh, well, we don't have to worry about all this rest of this stuff. We can continue burning because we'll figure out how to capture it. That seems to be a very dangerous strategy.
And the thing is that the way that we've evolved in our understanding of how, for example, wells work when we're producing well, we are having to go through that evolution of understanding in the reverse now, in the sense of we now need to understand, well, how well can this well seal what we put in there? There's a lot of question marks around that. There's also a lot of question marks around, well, can you really do this everywhere? Everywhere you think you can do it?
Last two questions, quick ones. What advice would you give to an innovator, to a startup, as they're looking at what arguably is going to be a massive opportunity as we transition from the grid that we've had for the last 120 years to something that's really quite substantively different? What advice would you give to someone that's saying, this might be a good place to build something, to contribute to this transition?
Fundamentally, I think to really internalize the fact that nobody has the answer. This is genuinely a brand new challenge, which has many different aspects to it. One reason also nobody has the answer is because it's an interdisciplinary challenge. And so coming at it from a holistic, interdisciplinary perspective is actually going to take things a lot further than simply looking at it from solely an energy perspective or solely a technology or solely a carbon perspective, because it's all of these things.
Now, I think that's actually a really interesting point. As I said, when I built this house, one of the smartest things I did was hire an energy consultant. Help through a decision process about what kinds of appliances and what kinds of heat and cooling systems and how much insulation and whether and where to put solars. That holistic view of, in this case, a very small system being a house, was absolutely invaluable and allowed me to compare and contrast and make trade-off decisions. As we think more broadly in terms of a neighborhood or a community or a city or some larger jurisdiction, the holistic view of demand response, generation, storage, transmission, micro contracting, transactive systems, that's where a lot of this challenge is going to be, is to figure out how to assemble all these components into a system that, as much as possible, dynamically adjusts itself to optimal conditions. That's a really interesting challenge, and I'm really hoping there's some smart innovators out there that are going to come up with some brilliant ideas on how to deal with this. Final question is just us as people that live and are hoping that we can will a sustainable planet to our children, our grandchildren. What can we do? What role do we play in being part of this energy transition?
I think we're all fundamentally mirrors of the system around us, and we all can tweak the system with our own actions. I would say the world that I would like to be building is a regenerative world. We've been building a very extractive world for the last 150 years. Sustainable is just the starting point, because sustainable simply takes us to net zero, but we want to be net positive, and that's regenerative. We're actually making the world a better place and not just simply extracting what's already there. I think there's an inner regeneration, which is changing the way we think about consumption, changing the way we think about what our real material needs actually are and the way we interact with each other and the world. And then there's the outer part. The outer part is where we've been talking about. I would say we can also focus more on the inner part, which is reflecting on what do we want the world to look like. And by doing that, we start acting according to that. If we don't even know what the vision of what we ourselves want the world to look like is, then it's very hard to act accordingly.
I expect that there's some just personal decisions that we can make about how much insulation we use and what kind of heating cooling systems and what kind of cars and what kind of products that we consume and how we choose to travel. There's all those kind of personal decisions. And there's probably some policy decisions, right? How we vote, how we express our interests to policymakers so that they build the regulatory frameworks that we're going to need to make all these systems work. Or how we invest and use our capital, our savings, and how we deploy them creatively in support of this new world that we hope that we're going to be building. Well, thanks so much, Vikram. This has been a great conversation. As I said it off the top, I've been wanting to have this conversation for a long time. We did do a previous episode of the podcast on regenerative finance and circular economies. It's a super topic. Yeah. I kind of left it a little bit out of this conversation because we had previously addressed it. But as you had mentioned earlier, that we could talk about this for years and years. And I suspect if we revisit this conversation a year from now, there's going to be an awful lot more to talk about. That's one of the things that's so interesting about this space is just how quickly it's changing. I'm really excited to be part of it. I'm so glad that you're in your position and doing what you're doing to be part of the solution. And so thank you very much for the good and hard work that you're doing. Thank you very much for sharing your insight and wisdom with us. And thank all of you for joining us today for this episode of W3B Talks. You can find out more information about the Shell Energy Transition Strategy 2024 by simply Googling Shell Energy Transition Strategy, or just go to shell.com and you can follow the link from their homepage. You can also find out more about this topic and many other topics at blockchainresearchinstitute.org. And while you're there, please consider subscribing to our newsletter. I'm your host, Doug Heinzman. We hope you've enjoyed this episode and that you will join us for our next episode of W3B Talks. Thanks again, Vikram.
Thank you.
Take care. Bye-bye.